The stale scent of last night's microwave dinner still hung in the air of the master bedroom. Sarah Miller tossed her worn-out blouse into the laundry basket, the fabric landing with a soft, defeated sigh. It was 4:30 p.m. The lull between the frantic energy of her graphic design freelance work and the predictable chaos of the evening routine. Her husband, Mark, wouldn't be home from the accounting firm for another hour. This sliver of time, this quiet transition, was hers alone. Or so she thought. Slipping out of her pencil skirt, she stood for a moment in her practical, beige underwear, catching her reflection in the full-length mirror on the closet door. At 38, she saw the map of her life etched onto her body, the faint silvery lines on her abdomen from carrying Jake, the slight slump in her shoulders from hunching over a laptop, the tiredness in her own blue eyes that no amount of concealer could truly hide. She and Mark had been together since college, a 20-year tapestry woven with threads of shared history, but lately, it felt like the vibrant colors had faded, leaving behind a comfortable, but monochrome, gray. She reached for a simple cotton sundress, the kind she wore around the house, when the bedroom door creaked open. It was Jake, their 11-year-old. His face was pale, his freckles standing out like scattered cinnamon dots. In his hand, he clutched her personal iPad, the one she used for work and, admittedly, for those late-night scrolling sessions when the silence of the house became too loud. "Mom," his voice was small, wobbling on the single syllable. "Jake, honey, I'm changing," Sarah said, instinctively crossing her arms over her chest. "You know to knock." But he didn't back away. He just stood there, his small frame blocking the doorway, his eyes wide with a confusion that was far too old for his age. He thrust the iPad toward her. On the screen was a messaging app she rarely used, one she'd downloaded months ago to communicate with a client whose company firewall blocked mainstream platforms. The client project had ended, but she'd never deleted the app. "Who is Ethan?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. The name hit her like a physical blow, a sucker punch to her solar plexus that stole her breath. The room seemed to tilt, the familiar landscape of her bedroom, the framed wedding photo, the stack of Mark's thrillers on his nightstand, the little clay elephant Jake made in second grade, swimming before her eyes. Ethan. It wasn't a client, it was a ghost from another life, a crack in the foundation of this one. "Jake, give that to me," she said, her voice tight, a thin veneer of calm over a rising tide of panic. She reached for the iPad, but he pulled it back, his small fingers gripping the device like a lifeline. He said he can't wait to see you again," Jake recited, his brow furrowed as he read the words on the screen. He said, "Last Tuesday was perfect." "Mom, what does that mean?" "Last Tuesday you said you had a late work meeting. You were with Dad and me at my soccer game." The lies, so carefully constructed and compartmentalized in her mind, now hung in the air between them, naked and ugly. Each word from Jake's innocent mouth was a hammer chipping away at the fragile facade of her marriage, her motherhood, her very identity. She felt exposed, more than just physically. Her soul was laid bare in front of her son, and the sight was horrifying. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. There was no dramatic confrontation with Mark, no heated argument, no carefully worded confession. It was this, her 11-year-old son, standing in the doorway of the room she shared with her husband, holding the digital evidence of her betrayal. "Jake, please," she whispered, her legs feeling weak. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the floral duvet cover suddenly feeling garish and mocking. It's complicated. He said he loves the way you laugh," Jake continued, his voice gaining a strange, flat quality, as if he were a detective reading a suspect their rights. "Dad says you don't laugh like that anymore." That final sentence shattered what was left of her composure. A sob escaped her, raw and ragged. She buried her face in her hands, the cotton of the sundress soft against her wet cheeks. The weight of it all came crashing down, the loneliness, the secret trysts, the exhilarating thrill of feeling seen and desired by Ethan, a charismatic photographer she'd met at a local gallery opening 6 months ago. He represented everything her life wasn't: spontaneity, passion, art. He made her feel like the woman she was before she became just a mom, just a wife. And now, because of a forgotten iPad and a curious son, the two worlds had collided with catastrophic force. Jake didn't come to comfort her. He just stood there, a silent, accusing statue. The iPad slipped from his fingers and landed with a soft thud on the carpet. He turned and walked out, pulling the door closed behind him with a quiet, final click. The silence he left behind was deafening. It was the silence of a bomb after the blast, the moment before the dust settles and the true extent of the damage is revealed. Sarah didn't know how long she sat there. The sun shifted outside the window, casting long, accusing shadows across the room. She had to move. She had to do something. Mechanically, she finished pulling on the sundress, the fabric feeling like a shroud. She picked up the iPad, her fingers trembling as she opened the messaging app. The history was there, in black and white. Flirtatious banter, intimate conversations, plans for their next meeting. The digital trail of her infidelity. With a surge of self-loathing, she deleted the app, but she knew it was a futile gesture. The damage wasn't stored in the cloud, it was burned into her son's memory. She found Jake in his room. He wasn't playing video games or building with his Legos. He was just sitting on his bed, staring at a poster of the solar system on his wall. "Jake," she said softly from the doorway. He didn't look at her. "Honey, I am so sorry you had to see that. I'm sorry for everything. Are you going to leave Dad?" he asked, his gaze still fixed on Pluto, the dwarf planet, small and rejected on the edge of the poster. "No," she said, and the word felt true, not as a promise but as a realization. The fantasy of Ethan, of a different life, had evaporated the moment Jake had spoken his name. It had been a mirage, and her son had just forced her to see the barren desert for what it was. Then why? He finally turned to look at her, and the hurt in his eyes was a physical pain in her chest. "Why would you do that? Don't you love Dad anymore?" How could she explain the slow erosion of a marriage to an 11-year-old? How could she articulate the feeling of becoming roommates who shared a mortgage and a child? The way conversations had dwindled to logistics, bills, schedules, grocery lists. The aching void where intimacy and connection used to be. She couldn't. It wasn't an excuse. There was no excuse. "I made a terrible mistake, Jake," she said, her voice thick with tears. "It had nothing to do with you, and it had nothing to do with whether I love your father. It was a selfish, horrible thing I did because I was lost. And I am so sorry I hurt you. That is the worst part of all of this." The front door opened and closed downstairs. "Hey, team, I'm home." Mark's voice, cheerful and oblivious, floated up the stairs. Sarah and Jake froze, their eyes locked. The countdown to detonation had begun. "Don't," Jake whispered, a plea. "Don't tell him." Sarah's heart broke all over again. Her son, in his profound innocence, was trying to protect the fragile ecosystem of their family. He wanted to bury the secret with her, to live with the rot festering beneath the floorboards. But she saw the cost of that in his eyes. It would poison him, poison all of them, slowly and irrevocably. She heard Mark's footsteps on the stairs, his familiar, heavy tread. He appeared in Jake's doorway, his tie loosened, a smile on his face that didn't quite reach his tired eyes. "Hey, what's going on in here? You two look like you've seen a ghost." He ruffled Jake's hair, but Jake flinched away. Mark's smile faltered. He looked from his son's stony face to his wife's tear-streaked one. The easygoing atmosphere of the room had been replaced by something heavy and charged. "Sarah, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice dropping to a concerned murmur. This was it, the moment of choice. She could lie, she could make up a story about a bad day at work, about a fight with a friend. She could preserve the fragile peace for one more night, one more week. She could let the infidelity live in the shadowy space between her and her son, a terrible bond that would forever alter their relationship. But as she looked at Mark, really looked at him, she saw not the boring accountant she had resented, but the boy she'd fallen in love with in a crowded college library. She saw the man who held her hand through a painful labor, who still made her coffee every morning exactly the way she liked it, even when they weren't talking. She saw the partner she was betraying not just with another man, but with her own silence and distance. And she saw Jake, watching her, waiting to see what kind of person his mother truly was. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the air tasting of salt and impending ruin. "Mark," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to talk. Jake, honey, can you please go downstairs for a little while?" Jake looked at her, a flicker of something, fear, understanding, disappointment, in his eyes. Then he slid off the bed and walked past his father without a word. Mark stepped fully into the room, his brow furrowed in confusion and dawning alarm. "Sarah, you're scaring me. What is going on?" She gestured for him to sit on Jake's bed, the action feeling surreal. This was where they read bedtime stories, where they comforted him after nightmares. Now it was the stage for her confession. She didn't sit. She stood, wrapping her arms around herself, feeling small and utterly alone in the center of the room. "Jake, he came into our room while I was changing," she began, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. He had my iPad. He found messages. Messages. What kind of messages? Mark's voice was cautious, a man sensing the edge of a cliff in the dark. From a man, she forced the words out. His name is Ethan. The name hung in the air, a verdict. Mark's face went through a rapid series of transformations, confusion, disbelief, and then a slow, dawning horror as the implications sank in. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly gray. Ethan, he repeated, the name a curse. Who the hell is Ethan? She told him. There was no elegant way to do it. The story tumbled out in broken fragments, the gallery opening, the initial friendship, the lunches that turned into drinks, the late, work meetings, the hotel room last Tuesday. She didn't try to justify it. She just laid the facts at his feet, a pile of ugly, broken things. She told him about the loneliness, the feeling of being invisible, but she made it clear that these were explanations, not excuses. The fault was hers alone. When she finished, the silence in the room was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking all the sound and light and hope out of the world. Mark stared at a point on the carpet between his feet. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He just sat, perfectly still, as if the news had turned him to stone. Finally, he looked up at her, and the look in his eyes was one she had never seen before. It wasn't just anger. It was a profound, soul-deep devastation. The man she knew was gone, replaced by a stranger whose entire reality had just been obliterated. All this time, he asked, his voice hollow. All those times you said you were working. You were with him. She could only nod, fresh tears streaming down her face. He stood up abruptly, the movement causing her to flinch. He walked to the door, pausing with his back to her. His shoulders, usually so strong and dependable, were slumped in defeat. I can't look at you right now, he said, his voice cracking. I need to get out of here. He didn't slam the door. He closed it gently, and the quiet click was somehow more terrifying than any amount of rage could have been. Sarah was left alone in her son's room, surrounded by the artifacts of the life she had jeopardized. The sound of the garage door opening and Mark's car starting echoed through the house, a sound of finality. She slid down the wall onto the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, and wept. She wept for Mark's broken heart, for Jake's shattered innocence, and for the woman she had become, a stranger to herself. The next few days were a frozen hell. Mark stayed in a hotel. The house, once a haven of predictable chaos, was now a tomb of silence. Sarah tried to maintain a routine for Jake, making his meals, driving him to school, but he moved through the house like a ghost, barely speaking to her. The connection between them, once her most sacred bond, was severed. She had betrayed her husband, but in doing so, she had betrayed her son even more profoundly. She called Ethan only once. She told him it was over, that her son knew, that her marriage was in ruins. He was understanding, almost too understanding, and she realized with a fresh wave of disgust that his role in her life had always been that of an escape, not a foundation. He was a fantasy, and fantasies can't survive in the harsh light of reality. A week after the confrontation, Mark came back. He looked older, weary. He asked Sarah to sit with him in the living room. Jake was at a friend's house, a deliberate arrangement. I've thought about nothing else for 7 days, Mark began, his voice flat and exhausted. I've thought about divorce. I've thought about throwing your things out on the lawn. I've replayed every moment of the last year, looking for signs I missed. Sarah listened, her hands clenched in her lap, bracing for the blow. But then I thought about Jake, Mark continued, his eyes glistening. And I thought about us. The real us, not whatever we've been these last few years. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since that day. We both checked out, Sarah. I buried myself in work. You found someone else. I'm not blaming you for my part in this. We stopped talking. We stopped trying. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a diagnosis. I don't know if we can fix this, he said, the honesty brutal and necessary. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. The image of you with someone else, it haunts me. But the thought of this family ending, of only seeing Jake on weekends, he trailed off, shaking his head. I'm willing to try, but it's not for you. It's for him, and it's for the people we used to be. But it's going to be the hardest thing we've ever done. Sarah nodded, a fragile spark of hope igniting in the vast darkness of her despair. It wasn't a reprieve, it was a sentence of hard labor. It was a chance to rebuild, brick by painful brick. The change didn't happen overnight. The first family counseling session was agonizing. Jake sat between them, a small, silent monument to their failure. It took weeks for him to speak, but when he did, his words were a gut punch. I feel like it's my fault, he whispered, staring at the therapist's rug. If I hadn't gone into your room, if I hadn't looked, everything would still be okay. That moment became their North Star. Sarah and Mark realized their healing wasn't just about them, it was about healing their son. They assured him, over and over, that he was the brave one who had told the truth, that he had done nothing wrong, that the problem was there long before he discovered it. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to rebuild. Date nights were no longer just dinner and a movie, they were structured, therapeutic conversations facilitated by their counselor. They learned to communicate again, not about schedules, but about fears and regrets and hopes. Sarah ended all contact with Ethan and focused on her family with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed. Mark made a conscious effort to leave work at the office and be present, truly present, when he was home. It was a long road, paved with setbacks and moments of searing pain. There were nights Mark would wake up from a nightmare, his body tense with anger. There were days Sarah would look at Jake and be overwhelmed with a shame so profound it took her breath away. But something else began to grow in the rubble of their old marriage. A new, more honest foundation. They were no longer taking each other for granted. They were fighting for each other. The passion that had died was replaced, slowly, by a deeper, more resilient connection forged in shared pain and a mutual commitment to their son. One evening, almost a year later, they were in the backyard, stringing up lights for a family barbecue. Jake was laughing, really laughing, as he tried to untangle a knot of wires. Mark was on the ladder, and he looked down at Sarah, who was holding the base steady. Their eyes met, and for the first time in a very, very long time, the look they exchanged wasn't filled with hidden resentment or the ghost of infidelity. It was simply a look between two people who had been through a war and were still standing, side by side. It held grief, and wisdom, and a tentative, hard-won peace. He came down from the ladder and wrapped his arms around her. It wasn't the passionate embrace of new lovers, nor the hollow habit of a long-married couple. It was the strong, sure hold of a partner. A promise to keep building, to keep trying. Jake watched them from across the lawn, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in a year. The wound was not gone, it would always be a scar, but it was no longer bleeding. The change had been catastrophic. It had shattered everything, but from the fragments, they had painstakingly pieced together something new, something stronger, and something infinitely more real. The infidelity had been the end of their old world, but the courage to face the aftermath was the beginning of a new one. And in that new world, they had learned that sometimes, the most profound love is not the one that never faces trials, but the one that decides to stay and fight for what remains, long after the easy thing to do would be to walk away.